I'm Ajay. I'm the manager of the Democracy and Technology program here at LAI. Also have a very long past in LGBT plus activism back in Brazil, now converted to tech here. It's a pleasure to have here to receive at the LAI Dr. Kevin Guyan. An accomplished researcher, author of this, which has already become quite an essential book for the so-called data scientists or the queer data research field. Dr. Guyan is going to speak about the rainbow systems, queer data, and the limits of LGBT inclusion, which will explain how systems translated into policy, documents, and so on affect the LGBT plus community. Dr. Guyan will be speaking for about 30 minutes. Then we have a Q&A. For those online, we'll be getting your questions. Please use the Q&A box on Zoom. And at the end, we'll be asking the questions. And please note that this session is being recorded. Thank you.
Thank you.
Going in.
Thank you, Ethelton. So yes, thank you for that kind introduction and the invite to come and speak with you all today. And thank you also to Ellen for all organization for today's event. So I want to start my talk this evening with a story. On the 17th of January, the UK government enacted previously unused powers and overruled a bill passed by the Scottish Parliament that would introduce a self-identification model for how trans people change the sex marker on their birth certificates. The following night, around 500 people gathered outside 10 Downing Street to express their outrage. Among a sea of trans people and their allies, one person held a large white placard with "Death to Admin" written in black marker pen. So the seemingly mundane topic of administrative systems and how they record LGBTQ lives has become a key frontier in the fight for equalities. In the UK, as I'm going to argue in my talk today, a situation exists where systems either need to adapt to reflect an always changing world, or LGBTQ people need to modify themselves to match the expectations of long established systems. This conundrum is what my current research currently seeks to answer. Can the rules of policies and practices of data systems ever accommodate the full diversity of LGBTQ lives? Or will efforts to make systems more inclusive always leave some people behind? So just a little bit of kind of some of the terms I'm using in the talk today. So system is a catch-all term I'm going to use to describe the rules and procedures that institutions and organizations follow to make something happen. In the talk today, I'm going to focus specifically around the collection, analysis, and use of quantitative data, but the reach of systems goes far further. And some of the work I'm developing at the moment looks at documents, policies, and bureaucratic practices. So think tax codes, insurance claims, immigration applications. This kind of systems approach applies very broadly. And I'm going to argue that for many LGBTQ people existing in a society where life is organized around a fixed gender binary and an assumption that everyone is heterosexual, can empower us to see who systems are designed to help work for and who systems are designed to work against. So I'm going to speak for about 25 minutes, and the plan of action for the talk today, I'm going to kind of introduce this idea of the rainbow system, this kind of concept I'm developing at the moment. I'm then going to apply that idea to two applications. So the first case study, a topic I know quite a lot about, Scotland's 2022 census. The second application brings us a little bit closer to where we are today, looking at some diversity data at the University of Oxford. And then finally, the takeaway, when I'm going to send you home with these three big ideas that I want to kind of hopefully make you think about in my talk today. So I hope that what I cover works across theory and practice, and my hope is prompt some new ideas, whether you're a researcher, practitioner, or professional, or just someone with a general interest in LGBTQ data. Okay, so I want to introduce the big idea, the main event, where I explain what I mean by a rainbow system. So I'm using this term to describe our current moment, where across many industries and sectors, LGBTQ people are not universally excluded from the design and operation of systems. In fact, in the UK, they are more visible than ever before. Now, although there is no one-size-fits-all model approach to how systems count, classify, and manage LGBTQ identities, the inclusion of LGBTQ lives relies upon certain common sense assumptions. So in a rainbow system, identities are imagined as something fixed in time and space, as something independent of the outside world, identity as something real or some sort of ontological truth, as something interoperable that can work across different types of systems, something pure and uncontaminated, and something that people can and should disclose. And I'm going to pick out some of these points throughout my talk today. Now, when something goes wrong with a system, the problem is most often understood as being related to misrecognition. In other words, data systems are not accurate enough, they're not detailed enough, or there's some error or glitch with how the system was designed. Misrecognition happens when systems classify the gender, sex, and/or sexuality of individuals in ways that goes against or contradicts the ways an individual might wish to identify themselves. So we see this in examples around tech platforms, surveillance tools, birth certificates, and identity documents, and just a few examples. But I want you to think, what if this is not a correct reading of the problem? Rather than misrecognition, what if systems are operating exactly as designed? And the problem, in fact, relates to how systems or whether systems make identities. And that's going to be kind of one of the threads running through my talk this evening. But wait, what, surely systems just reflect the outside world around us? Well, not always. Systems can play a key role in authorizing the existence of different identity groups, whether it's options presented to us on a website drop-down menu, or in my work, the boxes you can choose from in a census. So rather than focus on what systems exclude or restrict, I'm interested in what systems produce or what systems bring into being. So I'm going to kind of dive a bit deeper here and throw at you an idea that's maybe a little bit challenging. So as I mentioned, the thread kind of that I'm exploring at the moment in my more recent work is a consideration of data practices, so the collection, analysis, and use of data as a description of the world, or data practices as something generative or a force that produces the world. And ultimately, what do these two understandings of data mean for how we experience and make sense of our identities? So this kind of work I'm developing at the moment, some of these ideas are a bit loose, some kind of a bit foggy, but this work's kind of being positioned alongside US scholars, including Paisley Curra and Susan Stryker, who've described how our encounters with systems do not just reflect a pre-existing world, but actually play a key role in its construction. I'll give you a few seconds to read the quote on the screen there. So alongside the work of Curra and Stryker, another amazing scholar working in this space is the fantastic Dean Spade, who's also described how systems invent and produce meaning for the categories they administer. In Spade's work, data practices can be understood as something generative. They don't just describe the world, but they bring certain things into being. Now, my final shout out is for the equally brilliant Sarah Ahmed and her writing on diversity work and complaint in institutions such as universities. Across several of her books, Ahmed builds on the idea of the performative discussed in the work of people like John Austin and Judith Butler, in which saying something brings a thing in names into existence. So I sentence you to 10 years in prison, I pronounce you married, and turning this idea to equality, diversity, and inclusion policies, Ahmed writes, I came to ask whether there's an investment in both law and policy as performatives, as if they do what they say, as if they bring something into existence. This is kind of some of the landscape for the work that I'm developing at the moment. And this got me thinking, what happens when we apply this idea of data as generative or productive to the idea of some real life examples, such as a publication of data on LGBTQ+ hate crimes? So this kind of alternate approach of looking at data forces us to ask new questions as to whether data describes a pre-existing problem, or whether the collection, analysis, and use of data generates new understandings as to what is considered a hate crime and who is considered LGBTQ+. So I've kind of set the scene, hopefully, as I mentioned, some of these ideas are a bit rough, but this is kind of the direction that my work is heading in, and explain to you what I mean by a rainbow system. But I'm also going to be honest with you. As Edgerton mentioned, it is Pride Month, but my idea of a rainbow system is not a celebration of inclusion, rights, visibility, or the benefits of being counted. Nobody wants to be the killjoy at the party, but when we talk about being included in systems, we need to consider the good as well as the bad. Then we start with the positive. I'm going to start by focusing on the good. And there are, of course, many, many benefits to being included in systems. Firstly, data systems claim to represent the world around us. So the inclusion of LGBTQ lives creates a more accurate picture and should enable LGBTQ equalities groups to raise awareness about challenges, change narratives, and direct resources to best address problems. Secondly, being included in systems is also affirmative. Now, this important point is often ignored, particularly by quantitative social scientists, but for many individuals and communities, it feels good to see yourself represented in a system. Now, I want to share with you this brief clip from a social media campaign I co-organised last year with the charity Scottish Trans, which highlighted the benefits of being counted for LGBTQ people in Scotland's national census. And hopefully this will...
A lot of trans people hide, and necessarily so, can be a pretty traumatic thing to come out trans, to actually be able to, if you can, to be able to stand up and go and be counted and be visible. I think visibility is one of the most important things in the kind of struggles we're having at the moment. Just to say to people, I'm just like you. I think this year's census is really important because through lots of campaigning and pressure, we've actually managed to get questions about our identity, trans people, gay people, and I think it's brilliant because apart from anything else, it's very affirming because you actually feel you're part of the society that you live in. To get the ability to actually tick these boxes, I think is brilliant. I'm really looking forward to doing that part of it. It'll give me a wee thrill.
I think this video does a fantastic job of kind of showcasing when you're brought into a system, you're no longer unspeakable. You are now part of the vocabulary. Now, I want you to keep these positives in mind because, as a warning, the rest of the lecture is going to focus on the limits of inclusion and the dangers of being brought into systems. Okay, so now for the bad. Although data practices are not often mentioned in this space, the dangers of queer inclusion has a long history that dates back to at least the early 2000s, and critiques of LGBT rights campaigns that prioritize entry into institutions such as marriage, the police, and the armed forces. In the context of the UK, an increasing number of data systems now count some LGBTQ individuals, most notably the recent round of UK censuses, which had new questions on sexual orientation and transgender identity. Now, the methods used and the extent of their coverage was by no means perfect, but we can no longer say that data practices overlook the existence of all LGBTQ people. So here I want to cite the work of some key scholars, including Lisa Duggan on homonormativism, Jasria Poor and David L. Eng on homonationalism, and Raoul Rowe on homo capitalism, who have described how the inclusion of some LGBTQ individuals can play a role in propping up systems built on histories of harm and exclusion. So I've kind of set the scene, I've described what I mean by rainbow systems and the context of the work, and now want to move us forward and apply the idea of a rainbow system in two examples to see what this tells us about the relationship between LGBTQ lives and different types of systems. Okay, so the first example, the first kind of case study is a country I know very well. It's kind of some recent events happening in Scotland. So it's a really exciting time to be a researcher, an academic, engaging in research into LGBTQ lives in Scotland, and with several recent or ongoing developments in government and parliament related to LGBTQ equalities. Now, the topic I'm going to focus on in this brief example relates to the addition of new census questions on sexual orientation and trans status or history. So if anyone has read any of my writing, you'll know I'm a bit of a geek for stuff around the census. And in these examples, data collection can increase the visibility of historically minoritized communities and mobilize action for more inclusive policymaking. Inclusion also challenges a design fault in data collection exercises that for too long assumed everyone is cisgender and straight. And for some, being counted in the census marks a pinnacle of LGBTQ inclusion and recognition by the state. But when we kind of scratch the surface and look beyond this welcoming and inclusive veneer, we quickly see that this national data exercise was not as inclusive as we might first assume. While the census did have new questions on sexual orientation and trans status or history, the exercise continued to require all respondents to identify their sex as either male or female. For non-binary people who may not identify in this way, selecting a binary sex option was compulsory, with non-completion risking a fine of up to £1,000. So I kind of share this kind of brief example to underscore how the inclusion of some LGBTQ people in systems is not a straightforward success story, as some might wrongly assume. In the case of Scotland's census, its kind of quantitative veneer, that kind of sense of a census as being a gold standard, masks design decisions that shine a spotlight on lives that meet the requirements of the system and exclude those who fall outside the criteria of what a census expects to find. So while some experiences are brought into the fold, others remain situated outside the system. And as the system now has a rainbow exterior, it is the most inclusive census ever to be conducted, documenting the ongoing exclusion of those left outside becomes even harder. Okay, so my second example brings us geographically closer to where we are sitting for those attending in person today, diversity data at the University of Oxford. So my recent writing and research has presented critiques of something that can be described as numerical diversity. So that is a counting of different identity groups, whether it's by businesses, organizations, governments, and comparing these figures against a benchmark or target, such as data from a national census. In these examples, the counting of LGBTQ communities can operate as a prerequisite for action to address structural problems that negatively impact LGBTQ communities. And I've picked out a couple of random examples. I know it's kind of blocking the quote, the text at the bottom, but this is from KPMG. The bottom example there, 2030 targets. And then the National Health Service also does quite a lot of work around trying to get its staff, its workforce, to reflect certain parts of society. Now, ahead of tonight's talk, I had a quick peek this afternoon at some recent diversity data for the University of Oxford on the sexual orientation of its staff. Now, the numbers I've shared on the screen describe the 2021-2022 staff profile by sexual orientation, with a headline figure on the right-hand side of 8% of staff disclosing the information, describing themselves as LGBT+. So what's interesting for us to think about here is how these numbers compare to national data for England and Wales of everyone age 16 or over, and this is data from the 2021 census. I've also shared on the screen data regarding the size of the trans population, though I couldn't find this data for staff at the university. Now, it's important to note that these figures are for the whole of England and Wales and not just the working age population, as would be the case with the University of Oxford data. It is, however, possible to look at geographical data in more detail. So when we take a peek at Oxford Central, you can see the size of the LGBT+ population jumps from 3.2% to 14.9%. And all of this information is available on this quite jazzy map tool on the ONS website. So I kind of share this data to make the point that there are potential benefits, limits, and dangers when we use numerical diversity data. One area of interest for me at the moment is the move among some companies to establish targets to increase the proportion of their out LGBTQ employees, numerical figures against which success, metrics, key performance indicators are measured. And my work at the University of Glasgow the past few years has focused on the cultural industries around television and film organisations. And you can see here the data for the BBC's 2023 diversity targets. Now, what they've done here around LGBTQ+ staff, as their targets have evolved into something I describe as an outness metric, where for the kind of the next periods, rather than setting a kind of numerical percentage, they're aiming for 50% of their LGBTQ+ staff to be out at work. Now, in my view, this is misguided and advances an assumption that all employees should be out in all situations and that bringing your whole self to work is the best option for everyone. I'm going to return to that idea kind of a little bit later on in the talk, because I think there's a lot in that around kind of outness as a diversity target. So we're reaching the home stretch, and I want to bring together some threads from what I've shared in my talk so far. And I want to share with you kind of three big ideas, three take-home ideas from my talk this evening. Okay, so number one, identities as something frozen in time and space. So for lives that are recognised in a rainbow system, LGBTQ identities are imagined as quantifiable characteristics, fixed in time and space, that exist without a history and possess a shared meaning across different types of systems. This is particularly apparent when we consider the collection, analysis, and use of data about LGBTQ lives. So for anyone who's involved in any kind of research or projects that involve collecting data about identity, you'll be aware that this kind of numerical counting is often the bedrock of many of these studies, but it presents identity as something frozen in time and space. However, we know this not to be the case. Identity characteristics are situated in space and time, as we see in studies of past cultures and different societies. What it means to identify as disabled in 2023 is different from 1973 or 1873. And that individuals' identities can also change over time. So people might change their religious identity, their sexual orientation, identify as disabled, or with a different ethnic group. So for anyone in the room or watching online involved in a people role or in a human resources department, just because you ask your staff to complete a diversity monitoring form back in 2020 should not mean that they're never again asked to share information about how they identify. So number two, my kind of second take-home point is, do you need to be out to be counted? A rainbow system forces LGBTQ individuals to change aspects of themselves to gain access to the system. For example, systems can only make sense of LGBTQ individuals that are out, so an open declaration of sexuality and/or gender identity has become part of the price of entry, or the kind of the ticket to gain access to the system. While this might seem progressive, outness is not desirable or possible for everyone and tends to benefit individuals who are already closest to the ideal of full equality. An amazing book I want to share is Information Activism by Kate McKinney. And in the book, McKinney writes, how coming out in the early 1990s and today is an imperative that exerts pressure on queer people with little regard for the different vulnerabilities that make coming out impossible or undesirable for some. So my point here is that being out is one of the key demands of a rainbow system. And finally, my third take-home point is a big question: is fixing the system the best option? As I said, we kind of face a situation where two paths lie ahead. And as people interested in what happens at the intersection of LGBTQ lives and systems, we face a question whether we should dedicate more energy to fixing systems in need of repair, or whether we should dedicate that time and energy to taking things apart and building something new in its place. Now, I kind of hate to find myself fighting for the status quo. It's really boring. But sadly, in many areas of my current work in recent years, this has been my focus. My work has tried to strengthen the resilience of institutions which are too often complacent on LGBTQ issues and empower them to push back against a growing tide of anti-LGBTQ attacks. By institutions, I mean governments, universities, law enforcement agencies, and other large organizations that govern our day-to-day lives. All of these institutions make use of data and increasingly capture data about experiences of queer communities. In Scotland, this kind of increased capture of data has provided a wedge opportunity for anti-LGBTQ attacks, with a particular focus on the exclusion of trans and non-binary people from data collection activities. So with this in mind, we must ask whether the current suite of systems that wish to recognise and represent some queer lives is actually worth saving. What if we come to realise that these systems have inequality and exploitation baked into them, and that no matter how hard we try, they cannot be fixed to build a better world for everyone? So this leaves us with one other option: abolition. If we stop trying to fix things, this requires a radical rethink of our relationship to systems. We move beyond the objectives of more visibility, more information, more data, and instead think about how we're constrained by the current design of existing systems. By saying no to the choices presented to us, we're not just being awkward, difficult, or to quote Ahmed again, killjoy, but we're challenging the narrow options that are understood as possible. So to conclude, I've spoken for about 25 minutes. Why does any of this matter? What is the relevance of these ideas? So as a strategy of diversity management, a rainbow system can bring under its control the unruly and kind of potentially destabilizing politics of LGBTQ identity claims, while presenting its activities as associated with inclusive practice of being counted. My notion of a rainbow system is a critique, not a celebration. It's a framing device that we can apply to systems and ask, with a turn to visibility, recognition, and being counted, what have LGBTQ communities lost along the way? A rainbow system does not reflect a pre-existing world, but construct a world that fits its requirements. And this leaves us with two paths ahead. We can try fixing the system in need of repair, or we can take things apart and build something new in its place. To be honest, I don't yet know the best path to follow, or if we have to only choose one path. But I look forward to exploring these questions in the future. And I hope that by thinking about what's happening at that intersection between LGBTQ lives and different types of systems sparks wider questions as to how we go about producing knowledge and ultimately how we change the world for the better. Thank you.
Well, that was brilliant. And thank you, Dr. Guyan, for this provocative and very insightful presentation. I think it really demonstrates kind of a node discussion on LGBT activism and research between breaking or fixing systems. This has been going on for, well, since
20 years.
Yeah, since we've been around basically, and there's no definitive answer to that yet. I think nobody has found, but this is a very good lens to this discussion. Well, before I take questions for the audience, I have one for myself.
Okay.
Well, I about 1 year ago, I used Queer Data, your book, to speak to a few census takers in Brazil who were about to actually just giving up on the idea of asking the questions of the Brazilian census of last year. They were looking for insights on how to better include questions about queer lives in the censuses. So I use some of your concepts. Thank you. And when I say that queer data is also about challenging the binary word and binary questions, and maybe allowing for multiple identities to be counted, I could see, like, in their eyes, the shock. Because the binary word is very, statisticians, data scientists, computer science tend to see the word very binary. So that being said, a lot of people here are producers of data themselves or users of data. They produce their surveys, or they use government surveys, and so on. So consider like this tension between breaking and fixing. What could researchers themselves, not as respondents of surveys, but as producers of surveys, do, considering this tension between fixing and breaking the system?
Thank you. And thank you also for your work in the space and your kind of engagement with the book. I do appreciate it as well. Thank you. I guess for me, it's often that kind of fundamental question is missing when we're designing a new project about whether or not we need the data. Yeah. So I didn't touch on it in my kind of presentation today, but prior to kind of writing the book, I worked for many years in equality and diversity work in higher education. And there was always a drive to get more data, collect more information. Let's commission a study on LGBTQ bullying harassment or promotion opportunities or a variety of problems in the university. Rarely do people ask, do we need the data as that prerequisite for action? And what is the role of data in informing or kind of being that kind of driving force to bring about change? I think often a lot of our work to address inequality, to address injustice, gets kind of caught up in that early stage around collecting data. How do we design the best drop-down menu? How do we design the best response options? And not asking whether or not we actually need that information. And I think if more researchers, more people working with data, more people who are in charge of designing and managing projects ask that core question, I think that'll bring a lot of benefits in terms of not wasting time, energy, money, resources, labor, emotion on projects that aren't really changing the dial in terms of the communities they're trying to help. So I think that's something that's missing from quite a lot of work in this space. And it seems odd as well for a researcher or a data scientist to kind of almost put themselves out the job by going, you don't need me, you've done enough here. I think there's a duty for us working in the space to critically think, what are we actually adding to the conversation? Or are we just producing more data about the problem when enough already exists?
Shall we? Yeah.
Okay. I can start with a personal thing that happened to me and then ask my question. Last year, I ordered an STD test from NHS, and I filled out a form that asked me my sex at first, and then my self-identification, where there was a drop-down menu that asked if I was a female, male, non-binary, or if I prefer not to identify, which was your suggestion. I preferred not to identify, but then I got a call that said that they couldn't send me a test kit because they needed to know my self-identification. And I said that, okay, then non-binary. And they said, like, no, you either identify as female or male, because what they actually wanted from me was if I had a transition history or what genitalia I had, which was not what the question was asking. So referring to what you were saying about like being affirmative, I think some of the, especially the services that government is providing, some data collection procedures should prioritize, I think, some of the biological, if you may say, facts than being affirmative. Do you think there's a kind of like a switch in that direction, or do you think there are like advantages or disadvantages and how we should address those?
Thank you. A great question. Thank you for sharing your experience as well. I think your question touches on two things. I think one side is kind of, we need to ask the question to get the data we need. So actually, if you're working for the NHS or a kind of medical health provider, asking in some instances about biological sex or about kind of genitalia will be the exact question that form needs to ask. It would make no sense to ask something, this kind of proxy question, where they're trying to get at that in a roundabout way. So actually, there are instances where asking about biological sex or kind of around sexual characteristics is the exact type of question they should be asking. In a national census, that's not the question I think they should be asking, but for something for a healthcare provider, that would definitely, in some cases, be the correct question. I think the second point you made around that kind of the problems around affirmative questions is also really important. There's no point designing inclusive response options or long drop-down menus if behind the scenes you're going to get a phone call saying, oh no, you still have to pick one. Or I've seen many examples where they'll offer maybe 5 gender options or 8 sexual orientations, but unless you pick kind of man, woman, gay, straight, bi, everything else ends up in the bin, or everything else ends up being aggregated into an other category. And it kind of defeats the purpose of designing that inclusive question in the first place. I think if you are going to do something inclusive, make sure that the analysis of that data is done meaningfully and it's not a tokenistic form of being affirmative or being inclusive. And also your first point, I agree with. So thank you for that.
Hi, just want to say thanks for giving this talk, and I'm sorry if this was already covered because I'm having a really difficult time focusing today. But the bit you brought up about should we reform or revolutionize, I think that speaks to something I saw recently. There was this video from, if you're familiar with Philosophy Tube on YouTube, he was talking about the faults of systems and the philosophy of system design and how the NHS as a system is inherently not inclusive towards transgender individuals. And does that not point towards the need for us to always think outside of reforming the system? But then what do you see as a viable alternative for us to create something new that is so out of the box that, you know, as someone not involved in systems design, I can't even conceive of it?
Thank you. A really good point. And I think I have not invented this idea, this concept. There's a long line of thinking, particularly in Black feminism, around kind of abolition politics, particularly in spaces around the police, around law enforcement and jail, prisons. What we don't see as often is this kind of thinking applied to data systems and the kind of data practices that we're engaged in. I'm still on the fence, in all honesty. I think using the example of something like a census, I'm not yet in the camp that we should be abolishing the census, we should be burning everything down. I think there are some benefits to being counted and included if that data is used meaningfully. So for example, in 2022, 2021, we've got this national data set of sexual orientation data across 3 parts of the kind of the 4 nations, similarly around gender identity data. If that data is used to meaningfully improve people's lives, then when it comes to the next census, I'll be in the camp saying, making more of these videos saying, get out, be counted, be recognized. If in 10 years' time, we find the census has done nothing with that data, it was purely tokenistic, it was about optics, I'm going to be in the opposite camp saying, take it apart, abolish it. We're not wasting our time or energy, huge amount of money in something that isn't delivering to the communities it's intended to serve. So I'm kind of a bit of both in the moment, which is a really kind of fudge of an answer. Maybe in the future, I will be fully in the abolition camp. But I think whichever side, or if you have to choose a side, there's definitely a benefit to engaging with these ideas and thinking, rather than just designing inclusive systems, do we actually need the system to exist in the first place, or is it unable to be inclusive through the very nature of what that system is trying to do? So thank you.
Was this question have a few online?
Hi. Gosh, I could ask a variety of questions. I think an idealism versus materialism tensions have been raised, and so while I won't press on that, I perhaps I could go there. I am interested in your examples of potential sites of resistance to this. I will nominate what I think is one, and I would like your opinion on whether that is a legitimate example, and whether if so, there needs to be more of them. Are you familiar with the club in Berlin called Berghain?
I am not.
Okay.
Tell me more.
So it is one of a number of clubs that has a practice whereby people are expected not to take photographs inside. It's policed quite aggressively. And there are other places that have this, including a party in London called Unfold and other clubs in London at periodic cases. It is, from my experience, that in places where this is rigorously policed, there is a strong correlation with queerness. Unfold has posters on GICs, how to get support and help, and it is openly and explicitly considered a queer space. Berghain, if you're only into techno music, you know this as like a techno place, but if you are a queer person, you know this as effectively a queer club or a gay club. And it's very obvious from inside that that's the point of it. I have not seen a lot of examples of this sort of thing elsewhere, where we think of rejecting recording, rejecting this, but I have seen it in queer clubs, in a variety of them, and it has kind of moved out. Would you think of this as a place of where we may reject a system by saying what's in here kind of stays in here and it allows people to be who they are in an indeterminate sense? And then if so, how could we expand that out beyond events where it's just like the place towards systems that exist beyond a particular event or place?
Thank you. I love that comparison. I never thought of thinking about data systems and censuses and stuff in terms of kind of nightclubs and nightlife. So I guess there's a few strands to your question there. One would be around, we don't necessarily, there's a space between participating and refusing. And I think in that space is subversion, is actually bending the rules, playing with the rules. And historically, when these types of exercises were done on paper, so the census has only recently pivoted to being a digital first exercise, it was easier to kind of bend, to kind of subvert, to kind of break the rules in ways. You could write in different answers. And we see that still around some stuff around birth certificates, some other identity documents. And historically, there are many fantastic examples of subverting the expectations, bending the rules to kind of reflect how you want to be counted and recognized. In terms of kind of refusing, in something like the census, I was very pleased to see that the questions on sexual orientation and gender identity were voluntary. So there was no requirement to participate. There were, I guess, some strategic political questions around that, around the size of the community, the size of the population. But it's not a case yet where you are required to share that information, unlike, for example, the sex question, which is a compulsory question. So we're kind of, I think it's new terrain. I think there's spaces where we can think, when are we subverting, when are we refusing, when are we participating? And I would love to have more examples where we're looking outside of data, whether it be nightclubs, to think, what can we learn from these types of practices?
Indeed, those places it's normative there, though. This takes courage to say you refuse, and you told that there's a punishment. I'd like to think of those as spaces that we can use as liberatory places to start thinking about this as a normative matter rather than one that you have to fight against in order to be non-identified.
And something I think the point you mentioned there about you have to be brave to do this, and maybe not so much in the context of the UK, but I was fortunate to do some work in Hong Kong earlier this year, and the census in China is still done. It was done a few years prior to that and involved kind of in-person enumeration. So somebody would visit your house, ask you questions about who lives in the household. And there was a fantastic subversive campaign around people who were living with their same-sex partner, who make the point that they're not flatmates, they are partners, to the enumerator, the in-person who came to the house, to get that recorded in the census. That is a huge act of bravery, to tell a stranger, to out yourself, to describe your living arrangements in that way. It's a form of politics. And I think looking at these systems around how data and identity is captured, you see many of those fantastic examples, but in many cases, it does require bravery to do it.
It's not set up that way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take the questions online. So, Nikita Gameja asks, since we're talking about breaking the binaries, do you think that preparing the systems on abolition to create new ones is a possibility?
Yes, I'm not going to say much more on that, Nikita, but thank you for your question. I think I've kind of covered that maybe with some of the questions that were asked after your question, so I'll leave it at that. Let's see, there's quite a few. I'll maybe scroll down. Thank you for these questions. Okay, I've just picked one which I can speak to from Vickery. So thank you for this question. So Vickery's question is, you mentioned outness as a new emerging measure or target for inclusion. It's really hard to imagine being out as a simple binary. Is it a variation in how organizations are measuring this? How and why are organizations using this measure? And do you have thoughts on this? A really fantastic question. I'm going to try and scoot back to the visual I used for this. And so as I mentioned, my work at the moment is in the cultural industries and film and television. And there's some really interesting stuff going on in this piece of data from the BBC's new diversity and inclusion target. Film and television, people might assume, is a very inclusive industry. And the issue with this figure was, unlike some of the other targets, there was often an over-representation of LGBTQ+ people working in the BBC's workforce. For me, this kind of masked a few issues. This large group of LGBTQ+ was not evenly spread. It was an overrepresentation of gay men and an underrepresentation of trans, lesbian, bisexual, and people in the other group as well. So actually shifting this target is probably doing a disservice to some parts of the wider LGBTQ+ umbrella. Also, how this figure, this kind of metric will be measured will be very challenging in that to kind of get 50%, you have to know what you're working from almost. So you have to know what the hidden 50% would be to then have this metric or this target. So it kind of raises the point that there are limits to numerical diversity when your organization, your employer is hitting those targets. So historically, you might have thought, actually, we'll say we want women to be 40%, we want people of color to be 10%, disabled to be 15%. Actually, when those targets are met, what happens next? I think this is an example of an organization doing some innovative work to think what happens next. But actually, with that innovation, there are some real political questions about A, how it will be done, and B, whether it should be done as well. And as I raised in my kind of my discussion of it, I think it's a very simplistic reading of being out. As the person who asked the question mentioned, it assumes you're either in or out. In an organization like the BBC, I imagine people who are LGBTQ will be out to some people, into some people. There'll be a closet that is always evolving. So I think this measure is quite crude, but it is an example of where this discussion might be going next in the future. I'll just look another one. Fantastic questions. They're all quite long questions. I'm trying to read through what people are asking. Okay, so there's a question from Scott online who asks around whether I've considered other data systems that have these resemblances of a rainbow system and whether they would benefit from asking these critical questions. Would you agree there's a case to be made for not knowing if this is better resembles the fluidity of identity? I guess my very short answer is yes. There are a variety of different systems, some involving more or less data. I mentioned stuff around policies, around kind of that space around bureaucratic practices that maybe don't involve as much numerical data. And I think in these spaces, there is a role for kind of not knowing or kind of reflecting the messiness and the fluidity of people's lives and experiences.
Do we have any more questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Well, that being said, this has been an amazing conversation. It's not ending, of course. this is an evolving topic. It will always be, in a sense, queer, the definition of queer has also always been challenged, its own definition, basically. So I'm very happy to have all of you here. This has been apparently one of the lectures that I have the greatest attendance. Thank you, Dr. Guyan, for this. And we'll be around. We're probably going for a pint afterwards. If anyone wants to join, please join us. And please give me a hand of applause again for that. Any final remarks, Evan?
No, I'm just delighted. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for the questions online. There was a lot more, but unfortunately, I just couldn't kind of get through them in time. But thank you for everyone who kind of joined me in person and online. And hopefully, these ideas of the rainbow system will evolve into something maybe more coherent. But this is kind of, I wanted to kind of share where my work's going next, beyond queer data, kind of zooming out and thinking what's kind of, how can we apply this kind of critical thinking for other spaces and places as well. So thank you, everyone.